my friends, welcome back to Garhdo Goes Geek. On today's episode, we're going to be turning another blog into a podcast episode just because there is more I think I have to say about it, even since writing it. And I'm going to talk about several topics that have been on my mind for months now, if not years, but have all kind of come to a head and coalesced after an article from Variety last year that seems to have highlighted just how prevalent these issues have become in fandom spaces and how long they have been an issue. So I hope you join me. We're going to be discussing why creatives shouldn't try to appeal to toxic fandom. Now, in an article published by Variety in October 2024, titled Toxic Fandom, How Hollywood is Battling Fans Who Are, quote, just out for blood, and I've got the link for it in the description below. And it starts by discussing some prominent examples of recent toxicity levelled by fans towards some high-profile shows, before exploring several steps that studios are taking in order to prevent these kind of vitriolic pushbacks, with one idea specifically cited being that of special quote-unquote superfan focus groups to assess marketing materials for major franchise projects, in addition to standard focus testing groups. Now, focus group testing is an important part of any film and television project. Discussing story ideas and pitches all the way up to showing early cuts of films is something that is done using focus groups comprised of many examples of a general audience. It's very, very common, and feedback from those groups will be used to develop ideas, approve shows, decide if reshoots are needed for a film, for example. Have they got enough information that the plot is easy to follow, that sort of thing. That's the sort of thing that focus groups are used for. Now, these focus groups become especially important for anything aiming to appeal to what's called all four quadrants of an audience. For anyone who doesn't know, the four quadrant audience is men and or women over or under the age of 25. So something is considered to have four quadrant appeal if it appeals to men over 25, men under 25, women over 25, and women under 25. And then you get a lot of things that don't appeal to all four quadrants, that are specifically designed to appeal more to men or to women or to over 25s rather than or specifically to under 25s. This is how quadrants work. But yeah, anything that's aiming to appeal to all four quadrants of a general audience will do a lot of focus group testing. So that's things such as these big tentpole blockbusters like Marvel's Avengers films or Star Wars or anything like that. And in fact, it quite regularly gets announced or leaked when films like these are undergoing reshoots, and reports of focus group screenings become a common source of leaks, not just for the content, but also perhaps the quality of a film. But I do have to question the logic behind trying to target fandom groups to help decide the development and marketing of franchise films and television. And especially the justification that seems to be that doing this will help to prevent toxic fandom engagement. So I wanted to go a bit more into that, and for that reason, that's why I've come up with this. I've articulated a lot of thoughts on the original blog, and I'm probably going to be elaborating on some as I go as well, and sort of confront a lot of my own thoughts about toxic fandom and the way it acts and the way it's being received, and in some cases, sometimes I feel actually appealed to, for better or worse. Sometimes it's also being rejected as well, but I'll get to that. So yeah, I suppose first we better get into what toxic fandom actually is. Like, what do I mean when I'm using that term? So, firstly, what is toxic fandom? A fandom is generally defined as a group of people who share an interest and/or a passion, and often feel a sense of camaraderie with each other. Fans usually act together in activities such as posting in online forums or discussion spaces, attending fan events, everything from a watch party to a convention, or buying or sometimes even making art or merchandise that represents their interest. So it's quite a wide topic of what can make someone a fan. Um, Toxic fandom, however, can exist when groups of fans behave in negative ways about their interest. And that can be a variety of things. Perhaps they're responsible for bullying other fans over their opinions or their likes or dislikes. It's like, oh, what do you mean you like The Last Jedi? How ridiculous of you, or vice versa. Oh, you hate the new Marvels movie. It's just because you're sexist, and it can happen both ways. There's definitely toxic elements are more negative, but sometimes the ways that people can respond to any kind of criticism by sort of getting a very aggressive pushback to it can also lead to its own toxicity. You can also get writing repeated negative comments about perceived changes or mistakes, quote unquote, that are being made to works. Like, oh, they've done this new thing and it's changing the lore, it's changing everything about it. Changes that were made to Rings of Power or Lord of the Rings, for example, and how they've changed Tolkien's vision. That sort of thing. Or perhaps the behaviours are even worse than that. That can happen as well, such as being threatening towards the actual creatives, sending racist or misogynistic or homophobic slurs at people, or moving on to more dangerous and illegal activity such as sending rape or death threats, or doxing or swatting, or harassing or stalking people in real life. All of these things have happened. These are all documented things. There are many celebrities, quite often female or black celebrities, who have come off of social media because of just the abuse they have faced from fandom groups. Now, Variety's own article does actually list several prominent examples of toxic fandom. It tells of Amandla Stenberg, who was the lead actress from Star Wars The Acolyte, talking on her Instagram about experiencing, quote, a rampage of hyperconservative bigotry and vitriol, prejudice, hatred, and hateful language. The article mentions the review bombing of House of the Dragon and The Last of Us after episodes that featured queer characters front and centre. It mentions the entire wing of YouTube that decries projects as woke garbage. The death threats faced by actors like Leslie Jones on the press tour for Ghostbusters. The social media backlash to POC actors in Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, or Bridgerton. And there are plenty of further examples that I could draw from even just from my own knowledge. Never mind, so much reporting that has happened over the years. Actors like Moses Ingram, Sonequa Martin Green, Anthony Rapp, Kelly Marie Tran, Tony Revolori, Jodie Whittaker, Ncuti Gatwa, Brie Larson have all received vitriolic abuse due to their roles in high-profile properties such as Star Wars, Marvel, Star Trek, and Doctor Who. And unfortunately, none of this is anything new. It's just something that is becoming far more mainstream as these properties that were once fringe are becoming more mainstream. As something like Star Trek, Marvel, Star Wars is generating more and more mainstream appeal, as such, this news is becoming more mainstream. This is things that have been happening for a long time. Like, there has been hate leveled at actors in, for example, something like Star Trek. Star Trek is a very old franchise. Some of the actors in the 90s were getting hate mail and death threats. Some of the actors in the 60s were probably getting hate mail and death threats as well. Something like this, though, isn't something that's necessarily accepted, but it is definitely being seen as more of an unavoidable inevitability of making some of these high-profile productions. And now I think most people will easily accept that the people behind this toxic online element of fandom culture are a small but very vocal minority. The majority of people who watch something like the new Star Wars show or the latest Marvel movie or House of the Dragon or anything else in the quote-unquote geek sphere are casual fans. They're the general audience. You know, these things aren't becoming mainstream because there's more geeks. These things are becoming mainstream because they are appealing to a mainstream audience. So most general audiences don't care about the things that the fandom do. You know, these people watch these things not because they're hugely passionate fans concerned about the lore and the storyline, or they're probably just watching because they enjoyed some of the previous entries, or they thought it looked fun, or maybe they have a crush on one of the actors. I know plenty of people who have watched things just because they know a certain actor is in it. You know, you might never watch a Marvel movie. You know, so you could have a person who had never watched a Marvel movie, had no interest in them, and then Benedict Cumberbatch got cast in Doctor Strange, and they thought, wow, I quite like Sherlock, and I like quite a lot of the other things I've seen him do. Let's have a look at this. That's a perfect example of bringing a mainstream audience to a more fringe property. The same with someone like Chris Pratt. You know, whatever your opinions on him may be, if you were one of those people who saw Parks and Rec, you thought he was a very funny person, you liked his character, then you saw the trailer for the first Guardians of the Galaxy, you might go, oh wow, he's in it, okay, I'll check that out. And that's what I mean by the general audience. The ride or die fans are a much, much smaller group. Even with this huge upward trend of geek properties in the mainstream, such as sci-fi and fantasy titles, increasing comic book and video game adaptations, and all these annual conventions that you're getting, the proportion of fans who engage in the toxic excesses, though, the ones who are directing the venom at the things that they claim to be the fans of, is even smaller than that. So, but because of the modern world, and especially access to the internet, that group is louder than they've ever been. You know, the internet is great at connecting people and allowing you to find a community for things you are interested in. It also gives every single person in the world a megaphone to amplify anything they want to say. And, you know, it allows everyone a voice. Anyone can express their opinion, whether that opinion is positive or negative, and anyone seems to be able to find someone who shares that opinion, regardless of how toxic that opinion may be. In fact, sites like 4chan and its ilk initially began purely for the reason of allowing people to say anything they like, completely free of censorship, while discussing things like anime and gaming and other fandoms like that. You know, there are huge tabletop groups on 4chan. You know, that's where, you know, you get a lot of, there's the whole Warhammer 4chan like wiki, almost, as 1d6chan it's called now, which built itself from a lot of that sort of edgelord 4chan nonsense, but it's actually a really good resource for anything tabletop gaming. And obviously, you know, being a fan of Warhammer, that's something I'm into. And it's like, if 4chan had hit at the right point for me in my development, that's something I probably would have been on. But, you know, that the negative aspects, every so often I read 1d6chan. You know, I use it as a resource when looking at Warhammer lore and reading things on it. But there is still things on there where I'm like, ooh, can't say that. Ooh, don't like that. And that's because, you know, something should be censored. I think there's some there's some very negative things that get said, and a lot of very negative and harmful stereotypes that are just not challenged. This is why sites like Twitter and Facebook have to have this content moderation, because they use it to get advertisers. You can't advertise on something like 4chan unless you really just don't care about your product. No one respectable is going to advertise on a website like that. You're going to advertise, because you don't want your content being put up next to something that is, Nazi propaganda, for example, which does happen. As more and more people can agree with some of these fringe opinions, they can get reinforced and their speakers can get emboldened, and then they can move into these less fringe online spaces. And while sometimes they may face sanctions on other social media sites like Reddit or Tumblr or Facebook or Twitter, they can still build a community, helped in quite a large part by the algorithms that share this content. Many creators on TikTok, YouTube, and elsewhere have spoken about how some of their best performing content in the algorithm is content that is antagonistic or controversial, such as negative reviews or covering an aspect of online drama between other creators. Even when people don't share their opinions, they can dislike or comment, which creates its own form of engagement and feeds the algorithm to push the thing further. As the old adage says, there's no such thing as bad press, and so as a result, toxicity is rewarded by the social media systems that us fans all use to engage with our fandoms, making something that we all know in our hearts to be a very small minority have a disproportionately loud voice. So, now that we have an idea what toxic fandom looks like and the forms that it can take, perhaps a more pertinent question would be why these fans decide to act in such toxic ways. Now, not liking a new iteration of something you're a fan of is not necessarily anything new, and in fact goes back to, in some cases, a lot of things that are nowadays considered classics. The Empire Strikes Back, for example, had negative reactions when it released. Star Trek The Next Generation definitely took a while to warm up hardcore fans. Many of the new actors taking on the role of Doctor Who took time to win the fans over after their regeneration stories, and some of them have even only done so now due to their audio work with Big Finish, which probably only even the most ardent fans are likely to have heard. I've seen people discuss how, for example, now they would count, because of his work with Big Finish, they'd count someone like Colin Baker as one of their favourite iterations of the Doctor. But most people will never hear those stories, and they will only judge him based on the TV work that they've seen, which is not great because of a lot of behind the scenes stuff. But toxic fandom goes beyond merely disliking something. In many cases, it's a very active hatred towards an aspect of a piece of work. And the most common cause of such hatred in the modern day especially seems to be the idea of quote-unquote woke. Now, the idea of something being woke is rooted in identity politics. That is, anything that centres an aspect of a person or a group's identity, such as their race, their class, their sexuality, their gender, their disability, their religion, etc., as part of any form of political movement. In fact, the term woke originated in black communities in America as a way of saying that someone was aware of the social injustices and discrimination that come from being part of a minority group. So they would, black communities would describe people as woke if they understood, for example, anti-black racism. Now, obviously there are many reasons why this might be done, why you might make an effort to be woke, to address social inequality, for example, or to recognize additional institutionalized prejudices that members of marginalized groups can face. For example, barriers to disability. You know, does your office for disability affairs, you know, does it have steps? Can someone with a wheelchair get into the building? Is the door wide enough? That sort of thing. You know, or a barrier to gender or ethnicity in the job market or social security, for example. You know, are names getting rejected just on the cover letter because of a more female sounding name or a more ethnic sounding name? Now, this is not to say that identity politics is a perfect solution. And in fact, many progressives even have argued that identity politics can create more issues by creating division and undermining Unitarian goals. However, it is much more hated by the right for a myriad of reasons, some of which, like the disputes from the left, are a sensible highlighting of issues with collecting people under a particular banner simply because of the one trait they may all share, or ignoring other aspects of non-identity based forms of oppression and exploitation, for example. But the most common detractions among many of the more mainstream right-wing pundits is that identity politics is not just highlighting issues, but actively pushing for those identities to the detriment of the majority. And one example they like to use in this is critical race theory, teaching that racism is a systemic issue, which is seen by its detractors as accusing all white people of being racist and humbling them in order to advance POC perspectives instead. Or the uses of non-binary pronouns being seen as an attack on binary gender identities. Or, you know, the current attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion policies in corporate America due to a belief that it discriminates against dominant groups. In fandom spaces, this kind of discussion is focused on things that are seen as pushing identity politics or pushing wokeness, and are heavily pushed back against by a subset of the fandom. For example, when I listed the actors above who have been attacked for roles in programs or films, you may have noticed how many of them were women, or people of colour, or queer, if you're aware of those things about them. You know, LGBTQIA+. And it tends to be these actors who are the ones facing pushback, especially if they take over the role of a character who is a straight white man in the source material, as many of the more toxic elements of fandom see this as the idea of woke politics being, quote, forced into our fandoms. And this pushback can be seen in many, many places. Many things that can be seen in fandom adaptations can be claimed by toxic fandom to be pushing a woke agenda. A greater representation of minority or queer characters is a massive one, with the inclusion of the first explicitly queer characters in the Star Trek franchise in the new series Discovery being accused of pushing an agenda and unnecessary, and even by some people being seen as contrary to the vision of creator Gene Roddenberry, which itself couldn't be more contrary to the truth. Gene Roddenberry was actively very much a proponent of those kind of things, but he decided to focus on race and women because he couldn't focus on everything at once as much as he wanted to. You know, when he started in the 60s, his thing was, well, I want to push races forward. When he came back in the 80s and 90s, his focus was on gender equality. The same kind of pushback was also seen at the casting of Jodie Whittaker as the first female iteration of the Doctor in the long-running Doctor Who franchise. Doctor Who is a series known for drastically reinventing its protagonist every few years, but for some people it seemed that the casting of a woman was just a reinvention too far. Other prominent forms of pushback can be seen when a character known by many as a white man is played by a person of colour in an adaptation, such as, for example, the Arrowverse actors Mikaad Brooks as Jimmy Olsen and Kanan Lonsdale as Wally West / Kid Flash. In many cases, that particular blowback was also framed as not being accurate to the source material, and one that I did see used as an excuse was the idea that Jimmy Olsen and Wally West are both red-headed characters, and the idea of them being red-headed was being erased by making them black. However, it's quite telling that that same accusation wasn't made at the casting of the brown-haired actor Colton Haynes as Roy Harper in the same universe. The accusation of a woke agenda can even be thrown at cis women who aren't considered traditionally attractive enough, such as Mary Wiseman in Star Trek Discovery or Emma D'Arcy in House of the Dragon. In fact, this kind of toxic pushback can extend to animation as well, and video games in particular can be a huge source of this kind of vitriol. Video games and animation. X-Men 97 announced that Morph would be non-binary, and toxic fans attacked. The Super Mario Bros. Movie trailer had Peach in trousers. Toxic fans attacked. Mortal Kombat toned down the revealing costumes of its female cast, and toxic fans attacked. Tomb Raider reduced the size of Lara Croft's chest, and toxic fans attacked. RPG games like Starfield and Dragon Age The Veilguard introduced roleplay elements for minority groups such as they-them pronouns, or vitiligo, or top surgery scars, and toxic fans lost their minds. And the less said about the reaction that the central character of Abby in The Last of Us 2 had, and her appearance and the actions in the story received from toxic fans, the better. And of course, the most interesting dichotomy of all this is the stance that toxic fandoms like to take, that pursuing these woke elements will lead to a lack of success on the part of the things doing it. There's a common phrase of go woke, go broke that gets used by a lot of these right-wing detractors, and this is used whenever anything perceived by toxic fandom to have woke elements underperforms, especially in the case of video games, but also in films. But of course, when something proves to be a success, these toxic elements then have to argue that this success was because the woke elements were more understated. For example, Jason Momoa is a non-Caucasian actor, but his casting as Aquaman wasn't woke, and that's why the first film was so successful, why Aquaman made over $1 billion. Baldur's Gate 3, which did many of the same things that Starfield and Veilguard were criticised for, obviously wasn't woke because it was incredibly successful. Same for X-Men 97, and so on and so on it goes. And it's incredibly inconsistent. But there is a reason for this. So, toxic fandom elements are fueled by a very prominent force that has gained quite a lot of traction and influence in the last decade and a half, and that is the prominent online Grifter Sphere. Now, essentially, as I stated earlier, much of the content that performs best in the social media algorithm is the content that is controversial and antagonistic, and content that enforces toxic elements is especially well rewarded. Film critic and YouTuber Bob Chipman, known as Movie Bob, has spoken several times about how his best performing video online was a very negative rant review about the Adam Sandler film Pixels, and that off of the back of that video's viral performance, he was approached by agents looking to sign him if he continued to produce that exact sort of content. Now, he declined, but the trend of the angry white male YouTuber is something that definitely remains. Many YouTubers with large figure subscriber counts, such as Nerdrotic, Critical Drinker, Heel vs Babyface, Endymion TV, Sargon of Akkad, Quarter Black Garrett, Chrissy Mayer, Chris Gore, and many others, either have on their own channels or as part of Nerdrotic's Friday Night Tights podcast, expressed plenty of opinions that match many people in toxic fandom. And the incredibly talented YouTuber Pillar of Garbage has done a video, one of many on the subject, that I'm going to link below as well, highlighting the connections between this group and many more established right-wing political influencers, including Alex Jones, Steve Bannon, Charlie Kirk, Milo Yiannopoulos, and from there the links continue outwards to many others such as Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, and Jordan Peterson. And essentially this creates like an alt-right geek sphere. What this creates is an entire economy in online spaces where geek-focused fandom content reinforces right-wing talking points such as white victimhood or men's rights activism or patriarchy, and even generic sexism, homophobia and transphobia, because sometimes it is just as plain and simple as that. It means that this toxicity is continually reiterated and reinforced to this subset of the fandom and constantly brought to bear on every new geek subject, and especially large topics such as the upcoming Marvel or Star Wars or video game releases, and usually with several key figures in the firing line to be blamed for anything that any of these people find egregious enough to complain about. And those figures are usually women. So, for example, if it's Star Wars, it's Kathleen Kennedy. Or minority or queer creators who are involved in the project who are accused of pushing an agenda by these grifters. I already mentioned Kathleen Kennedy. Brie Larson is another frequent punching bag, as well as Amy Pascal, who's who works at Sony. And many of the other actors that I've all previously mentioned up above, and other creators as well, people like Russell T Davies and many of the other people that I've already spoken about. Russell T Davies, for example, gets a lot of hatred for being an out queer man on Doctor Who. So it all seems part of this long con almost to try and twist cultural perception, to try and legitimize and make mainstream conservative talking points, and most importantly to make money by exploiting an algorithm that actively rewards this controversy. So when I say that creatives shouldn't try to appeal to toxic fandom, I specifically am referring to the Grifter Sphere that pushes this toxicity that is expressed by the fandom, who have made influencing these creatives to avoid any sort of progressive theming one of their key goals. These people would like nothing more than content that reinforces their worldview, and obviously I think that would be to the complete detriment of everything that makes these franchises great. It would be the media and franchises like Star Trek, Star Wars, Marvel, DC, Doctor Who, and so many others that I have spoken about either in this episode or elsewhere on this podcast, is, I firmly believe, progressive by design. It is meant to challenge the status quo and argue for what is right and just and moral. And the fact that the pushback that content is getting at the minute for challenging modern sensibilities and modern views by trying to be more representative of the actual society in which we live, and is getting pushback from these sort of people who wanted to go backwards to become something so stale and trite, who don't want to be challenged, who who don't want to have to think about these things. These are the exact people for whom these messages are being made, even though we know we're not going to win these people over, but we're going to win over people who maybe watch their content and think, they see a video talking about how modern Star Trek is one of the worst things ever, and it's so awful, and it's full of deviancy, and because they like to equate queer things with deviancy, and it's about raising white people, or whatever their thing is that they're coming out with, whatever nonsense they're coming out with this week. We know that say for example the new Star Trek, it isn't going to appeal to them ever, but there will be people who maybe watch their content and then decide, oh, I'm going to go watch this thing and see how bad it actually is. Especially, Star Trek, I used to love Star Trek, let me go and see how much they've ruined it. And then maybe that person actually gets into it and thinks, well, hang on, most of what they've said is complete bollocks. They're saying, oh, this is awful and it hates white men, and oh no, there's several prominent white male characters. It's just that there's other prominent women and minority characters as well. That's not a bad thing, is it? Surely that's the people we're trying to appeal to with this content, because you're not going to change the minds of any of these grifters ever, but you'll change the minds of their audience, and that's what you want, because you want them to lose their audience. And because they are on the wrong side of history, on the wrong side of this discussion, and they know it. They have to know it, surely. But then at the same time, so much of this alternate right wing is so emboldened in the rest of society that is it any real wonder that they're so emboldened in fandom spaces? But yeah, regardless of any, this is a topic I could rant about, but I'd lose the structure quite quickly, as you may have noticed, because I can get very, very het up about this. So I'm going to come away from this, and I want to move on from the grifters and the toxic fandom aspects and look, I think, a bit more broadly at what I think the role of a creative should be in creating these properties, in creating for these properties. It is not the job of the artist to give the audience what the audience wants. If the audience knew what they needed, then they wouldn't be the audience. They would be the artists. It is the job of the artist to give the audience what they need. That is a quote by Alan Moore, the legendary comic writer behind Watchmen, Batman the Killing Joke, V for Vendetta, Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and many other works across his storied career. He is a man who has built his career out of telling unusual and groundbreaking stories, many of which iterate on popular and beloved characters. And the view he has here has been shared by many others in creative positions, with a similar quote of, never give the audience what they think they want, give them what they really need, being attributed to many people over the years, including Marvel creators and editors Stan Lee and Joe Quesada, and Star Trek Deep Space Nine showrunner Ivan Stephen Bear. Now, in many ways, listening to fans can be a good thing. The most recent and high-profile example of this, I think, was the redesign of Sonic the Hedgehog for the first film after the negative reaction to that film's first trailer. The film was delayed so that the character could be redesigned to more closely match his video game counterpart. And I truly believe that this undoubtedly led to the film being far better received than it would with the original design, because so much of that original film was predicated on caring for the character of Sonic and being endeared to him in the same way that the human character of Tom is. And I don't think that same endearing aspect would have been possible with that original design, as seen by the negative reaction to that trailer. And this, I think, has paid off, because it's now led to 2 sequel films, a spin-off streaming series, and a further film in development. There were also the fan requests for the release of the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League, which was received very well when it released on HBO Max, with many fans raising significant amounts for charity in the name of that movement. However, that group also had many toxic elements present as well that has been very well documented, and I don't want to highlight any further. And in fact, a lot of times the toxic elements have been excused by saying, oh, look how much they made for charity, whereas I do not believe that the toxic elements were paying towards charity. I do not believe the people paying towards charity were toxic, and it's two elements of the same fandom. But that's the last time I'm going to mention it. So, there are probably multiple examples across comics, novels, video games, and TV where fan reactions to characters and plot elements have led to an elevation and focus on those elements. There are definitely many characters and concepts in long-running TV shows especially that have taken more of a focus due to audience reaction. Like, there are huge lists of characters in TV shows especially who were maybe introduced for a one-off appearance or a particular storyline and became so popular with audiences that they were brought back or turned into major recurring characters. And characters introduced as part of a storyline, maybe even expected to die at the end of it, have then been saved, or recurring characters joining the main cast. It happens quite a lot. Tallulah's rewatching Bones recently, and she's currently on season 3, so I've been watching some of it with her. There's a character in that, I've forgotten her name off the top of my head right now. Camille, who was introduced in season 2 and was expected to be killed off by a serial killer who was a main part of that story in season 2. That character was that popular they kept her and added her to the main cast, and she went on to serve until the end of the series. And there's many more I could think of where that's happened. There are also times perhaps where it is important to ignore the fan reaction, especially that initial fan reaction, and let things find the audience for them. A good recent example of this is The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Even beyond the toxic responses that were received for that first season, the first season was not that well received by audiences. It was not necessarily hated, but it wasn't received to the extent that Amazon thought it would be. And so Amazon actually did some research as to why. As a result, the second season released last year was much better received, and by that point had also managed to shake off a lot of the toxic elements because they no longer bothered with it. Their initial pushback to it had been done. They weren't bothered by season 2. As a result, season 2 has been much better received. Ooh. Sorry about that. Someone just decided to rev down the road on a motorcycle. Season 2 was much better received and without those toxic elements because the toxic fans had gone. In contrast, however, the recent Star Wars series The Acolyte had its own second season cancelled, in large part due to the negative fan receptions, despite it apparently being a very well-performing series for Disney+, being apparently the second most watched series on the service in 2024, behind only Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Perhaps in another more positive example of there being no such thing as bad press, as the online controversy probably caused more people to check the series out than otherwise would. Star Wars also has two other quite prominent examples of both listening to the fans and also giving the fans something unexpected that they needed. Firstly, after the very mixed and incredibly toxic reception to Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi, especially in contrast to the huge success of the previous film, The Force Awakens, the final film in the planned trilogy was excessively retooled by Disney and Lucasfilm. Colin Trevorrow, who was assigned as director, was removed, his script was replaced, and The Force Awakens director J.J. Abrams was then hired to write and direct the final installment. Now, the reaction to the finally released film, The Rise of Skywalker, was perhaps as mixed among audiences as that of The Last Jedi. However, nowhere near as toxic, as many elements of that film were either changed completely or outright ignored, making the film feel like an attempted apology to all of the fans that didn't like the previous film. Of course, that then backfired for anyone who did like the previous film and their reaction to Rise of Skywalker. I've yet to meet anyone who likes both of them. You seem to fall into one or the other. For me personally, I prefer The Last Jedi. However, they also surprised many fans with the release of the streaming series Andor. Focusing on the Rogue One character of Cassian Andor, the show was a prequel of 12 episodes set 5 years before the character's death in that film, and told the story of him joining with the rebellion against the Empire and the battle against the fascism that they were enforcing upon the galaxy. This series was a smash hit among both critics and fans. Many fans really enjoyed the tone and style. The second series has just finished its run and was even more warmly received than the first series. It serves as a perfect example of Alan Moore's quote earlier, as Andor seems to be something that fans didn't know they wanted, but I think fans definitely needed, especially in the modern day that is seeing a rise of fascist ideology across the Western world. I'm reminded of the Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie episode of The Simpsons, which, if you're watching this on YouTube, I've probably used some images from in my title cards already. Because it's a great episode to pull images of things like a focus testing group from. Because in their effort to revitalise the show Itchy and Scratchy, they conduct focus testing using the children of Springfield, only to receive a very mixed group of answers, suggesting that the audience truly doesn't know what it really wants until they have it, where they will either enjoy it or, as they do with Poochie in the episode, reject it outright. Now, of course, there are things besides the audience that can restrict a creative to an enormous degree, especially in films and television, where producers and executives can meddle to sometimes insane lengths. In fact, the Poochie episode of The Simpsons also demonstrates this quite well, as the studio executives are involved at many stages during the creation of the new character, for better or worse. And there are many examples of films being hugely altered away from directors and writers, sometimes even to the point that the final product is drastically changed. David Ayer's Suicide Squad is a prominent example from the past decade that I know I've spoken about on the podcast before, where Warner Brothers executives gave the film to a company that edited the very well received trailer and told them to recut the entire film. And other creatives, such as Josh Trank on Fantastic Four, the one that's called Fant Four Stick, Joel Schumacher on Batman and Robin, or David Fincher on Alien 3, have spoken about having their films edited and drastically changed from their original vision after principal photography was finished. Now, while the examples I've used are ones that in many cases arguably drastically hurt the final product, this isn't always the case, and in many instances notes from studio executives can be used to drastically improve the finished product. And in fact, that is probably so common. It's so common that studio executives are involved in film production, influencing every stage of the production, that it's more often that we hear about when notes are rejected or when the studio interference negatively impacts a film than we do otherwise. Marvel Studios, for example, is very heavily involved in both the pre- and post-production work of its films, And, with pre-production starting years before even directors are attached. And for the most part, this is either not noticed or actually lauded by the audience. However, when creatives are hampered by the executives, it can become noticeable even without any explicit confirmation. A good recent example for this is Madam Web, which I'm going to be speaking about further on in the podcast, not this podcast, but in a future episode, in more detail. It's very obvious that film has been drastically re-edited from the original director. Since principal photography finished. In the post-production work, that film has drastically changed. So obviously I believe that creatives should be allowed to tell their stories, and that those stories should be judged by the audience on their own merits. In an ideal world, I think that this would be done without any overt influence by executives, for good or for ill. As in many of the most notable cases, I believe that such executive interference does nothing but dilute at best and mangle at worst the creator's original intent. Say something, for example, about Marvel Studios and how heavily involved they are in the production process. It leaves the Marvel films feeling very middle of the road. They don't have much to say. They're very diluted. They're very corporate in a lot of ways, very cookie cutter. And part of that's probably because there is no singular creative telling the story in quite the same way as there is in, for example, the comics. It's for this reason that I'm so in favour of the release of director's cuts of films and seeing deleted scenes and abandoned concepts and rejected scripts, and learning so much as I like to about the production of the things that I love, as I think there can be many, many good reasons why ideas are changed. And, other contributions can come from the actors or other creatives involved in the process that can help to improve the final product. But I think the creatives should be the ones guiding the story and telling the story they want to tell, even in a collaborative media like film. Everyone wants to put their own viewpoint across, and sometimes that is going to lead to clashes, and not everyone's vision is going to make it into the final product, but I do think it's for the best that as much of the creative's vision is there as possible. So bearing that in mind, then we then land on an important question, especially when concerning fandoms, which is, should creators be fans of the franchises that they create for? Now, naturally, after everything I've said so far, you might perhaps think that I am of the opinion that it makes the most sense for creators in a franchise to be a fan of that franchise, right? I mean, the thing is, fans as creators can pose their own issues and their own problems. To go back to that Alan Moore quote, fans as creators can perhaps focus too much on giving the audience what they want to see rather than what the audience needs, and that can become a hindrance to the work because it can just bog it down with fan service. A good example of fans and non-fans as creators and the various impacts that can have can probably be found within the Star Trek franchise. Star Trek the Motion Picture was overseen directly by Gene Roddenberry, and it was not very well received by fans, audiences, or critics, with Roddenberry's tight grip of the project being directly blamed by the studio for the failure of the final film. As a result, when the sequel was greenlit, Gene Roddenberry was sidelined to an advisory role, and the project was handed to writer-producer Harve Bennett and writer-director Nicholas Meyer, with Meyer especially having no prior experience with Star Trek at all. The film they made, created by Harve Bennett as a sequel to the episode Space Seed, was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and is generally credited with reviving what at that point was an ailing franchise. The two of them later returned and collaborated again on Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, which went on to become one of the most popular films with general audiences and became very financially successful. In fact, Voyage Home was the one that led to the studio greenlighting the new Star Trek show, The Next Generation. However, in the 2000s, the poorly received and for a while the last Star Trek film, Star Trek Nemesis, was directed by Scott Baird, who had been hired deliberately as a non-fan to inject some fresh energy into the franchise after the poor performance of the previous film, Star Trek Insurrection, which had been directed by Jonathan Frakes, the actor behind Commander Riker. Instead, what resulted was that Nemesis failed to find any audience. It underperformed its predecessor and became one of the final nails in the coffin that the franchise found itself in for some time. At least that was until 2009 and the release of the simply titled Star Trek, a collaborative effort by Roberto Orci, Alex Kurtzman, Damon Lindelof, Brian Burke, and J.J. Abrams. Orci and Lindelof considered themselves Trekkies, Kurtzman considered himself a casual fan, Burke was a non-fan, and Abrams described himself as definitely much more of a Star Wars fan, someone who was aware of Star Trek but not really even enough to be a casual fan. What resulted was an incredibly popular and very successful film that served as a reboot to the franchise, led to 2 sequels, and eventually saw Kurtzman hired as a producer overseeing the current crop of Star Trek projects at Paramount, including Discovery, Picard, and Strange New Worlds. In fact, Star Trek 2009 became the best performing film in the franchise. It actually beat the Voyage Home's total, which up until then had been record-setting. Now, there has been some criticism from fans and reviewers of the new shows that they maybe rely a bit too much on nostalgia and fan service, a criticism that I tend to agree on for the most part, but the success that the franchise is currently seeing is pretty unparalleled, and it's definitely, Star Trek is at its most successful point now than it has been in its entire history, I think. I say now referring to the modern day, and where a few of these shows have actually come to their conclusion now. And the mix of fans and non-fans in the creative teams is a large reason why that might be the case. So as you can see there with Star Trek, we've had examples of fans as creators, non-fans as creators, and then a mix of fans and non-fans, and how it's led to success and failure and then success again. There are other examples of non-fans creating works, though, with mixed results, but all with their own fans, including examples that I have spoken about previously in this episode, such as Star Wars. One example I want to highlight that I have done a review in a previous episode for is Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. That was a brilliant film that I've spoken about it before, but the filmmakers were not fans of the classic tabletop RPG, and instead they simply used the universe as a backdrop to tell the story that they wanted to tell, which also feels very, very apt considering the source material. Zack Snyder, for example, was famously not much of a fan of the DC superheroes when he began his work on Man of Steel. And across the 2 subsequent films he worked on, for better or ill, he crafted a very unique and singular vision of those iconic characters, which may not have resonated strongly with the general audience, but definitely still had its fans. Ira Steven Behr spoke on the Deep Space Nine retrospective documentary What We Left Behind about how he felt that his show had to earn the respect of Trekkies, and in many ways probably upset many of them, but that it's paid off in the fact that that show is very well regarded by fans decades later. Marvel editor Joe Quesada, never a fan of the idea of Spider-Man's marriage to Mary Jane, and a fan of the younger iteration of Spider-Man who felt that the marriage aged the character, created the infamous story One More Day, which removed the marriage in a literal deal with the devil. This story was very unpopular with fans, but then led to many subsequent stories that have been very beloved and possibly could not have existed had the marriage remained, such as the Superior Spider-Man run. And most people in supervisory roles on Star Wars properties are fans of the franchise to some degree, such as Dave Filoni, Jon Favreau, Rian Johnson, J.J. Abrams, et al. And yet the projects in that series have all been variously received by fans over the years. So it's a very mixed bag, and as I said before, I believe that creators should be allowed to tell the stories that they want to tell, and that it probably doesn't matter all that much if a creator is a fan. You know, to use the examples I've spoken about, Joe Quesada, I think, by being a fan of that a particular iteration of Spider-Man rather than Spider-Man as a character, as a complete character, pushed the something that he wanted onto the audience. Zack Snyder told the story that he wanted to tell, and for some fans it was what they needed to like those characters. There's a lot, non-fans can make great work in a franchise just as much as fans can make a bad work, and vice versa. And regardless of anyone's thoughts about the work, the people involved, whether they're actors, directors, writers, producers, artists, or anything else, do not deserve any of the toxicity that can be directed at them personally by anyone who didn't enjoy their work. And that should go without saying. Like, it's one thing to say that the latest entry of your favourite franchise is something that you didn't enjoy. And I've done that on this podcast, and I will do it again. It's one thing to say that the writer or director or whatever other creative was totally wrong in their choices, or that you think the actor did a poor job in portraying the character as you know them, as you've envisioned them. However, it's quite another thing, I think, to personally attack the people involved or to hurl abuse at them. And like I said, you would really think that statements like that wouldn't need to be said. But when I see the toxicity that can be present in areas of fandom spaces directed at the people involved in a piece of work that supposed fans just didn't like the existence of the new show being described in such hyperbolic ways as destroying their childhood or ruining the franchise or any other ridiculous hyperbole, I feel nothing but shame that I share these areas with people like that. I don't want to be fans. I don't want to be considered a fan if that's how a fan acts. So, to go back to the starting point for all of this and to try and bring everything to a conclusion, I think I have made abundantly clear that I think toxic fandom is very much a minority, albeit a disproportionately very loud one, and one that is influenced by an alt-right grifter culture, and that the risks of creatives listening to their advice and guidance would do nothing but lead to weak, stale, and disappointing products that do not serve the general audience of fans for that work. To go back to the quote earlier, it is the job of the artist to give the audience what they need. Fans need works that challenge them, that toy with their expectations and beliefs of what something can be, especially in the cases of long-running franchises, and more importantly, that leave an impact beyond that first experience, the film, game, novel, or comic that you're enjoying as part of the latest entry in your beloved fandom, you know that it has left a mark when you sit and think about it after that first time, whether for good or for ill. And in many cases, that's probably what led to you being a fan of it in the first place, is sitting there and thinking about it afterwards. In fact, in some ways, you could probably argue that by that metric, the things that these toxic fans are getting that upset about, that are causing that vitriol, are exactly what they do need. As the fact that they can't stop thinking about what has irritated them so much shows that it has had a lasting impact. But I don't think you could ever get any of them to ever admit this. So yes, I do believe that any attempt to appeal to toxic fandom in any way is the wrong choice for the creators of the works that these fandoms follow to make. I don't believe that toxic fans would ever be satiated if even minor appeals were made, and I believe that they would exert greater and greater influence and control were they given a single appeasement. You know, give them an inch, they will take a mile, as the old phrase goes. I believe that it's much better to just ignore them outright, to not amplify their voices, and to prosecute them when they become abusive. I do not endorse any level of toxic fandom in any of its actions, and I think that anyone who harms anyone else, or even threatens harm, as that in itself is harmful mentally, deserves punishment. Unfortunately, though, I do think that toxic fandom is something that's not going anywhere anytime soon, and is something that we are going to have to continue to endure. And I understand creatives wanting to minimize the backlash they will face for their own mental health, if nothing else. Especially in their modern age, where some backlash can not just be immediate, but grotesque in its severity at times. And I agree that steps should be taken to keep creators safe from harm. But I don't think it should ever be to the detriment of the story being told, of the art being made. Because I think that is what has been important enough to create these fandoms in the first place. So yeah, thank you for joining me for that one. It's intense. There's a lot of heavy things to talk about. Obviously this has covered some very heavy and potentially triggering topics, so I hope that everyone out there stays safe, looks after themselves, reaches out for any help if they need it. I'm going to be back with more episodes in the future. I don't really want to focus on any toxic elements in the future, unless I really have to, but I really don't want to. It's not something I like to discuss. I don't like to dwell on the negativity, on the toxicity, if nothing else because it gives these people air and attention, and you know, feeds the flame in a way that I don't think we need. So yeah, let's avoid that if we can. That would be great. Until next time, all of you, look after yourselves, take the best care of your physical and mental health as best you can. You can find, as I said, this episode was originally a blog that I wrote on my blogspot. A link for that is in my link tree, along with anywhere else if you want to follow me on social media, if you want to follow my gaming content, anything like that you can do. You don't have to. It's very much appreciated if you do, though, as well as, you know, like, subscribe, all the other things that help me get this podcast, get these messages out to the people that I want to find them. You know, I want to find fans in the same way as anything else. I want to talk about these things with other people. So until next time, you all look after yourselves. Take care. Until next time. Bye for now. thank you for joining us here at Garhdo Goes Geek. Your support of this podcast means the absolute world to me, and I am grateful to everyone who listens. If you wish to engage more with myself and my co-hosts, we have a few other ways to do this. Firstly, if you go to the link tree linked in the description, you'll find links not just to this podcast on every platform, but also to our Discord server, where you can interact directly with all of us, and a link to a dedicated subreddit for this podcast. There is also a link to a supporting Blogspot page, where I'll be posting supporting material for this podcast, including progress updates, schedules, and watch orders for the content I cover should you wish to watch along with me. I also have a link to a Spotify playlist featuring some of the music items I've discussed in the podcast. You can also add me on Facebook if you so wish, or follow on Twitch, where I'll be hosting a weekly stream. Finally, there is also a link in there to Ko-Fi, where you have the option to leave a one-time tip if you so wish, or alternatively to commission your own podcast episode. So if there is a topic you would like me to cover that I have yet to do so, then you can request I cover it for a small sponsorship fee. However, if you do not have the means to do so, then all I ask is that if you could please like, subscribe, and share this podcast with anyone else you think may like it. I love you all. Until next time, bye for now.